It was 1944. France had just been liberated. The flags were out. The streets smelled like cigarettes and relief. Women kissed soldiers on cobblestone roads. Champagne ran down strangers' wrists. The newspapers called it the greatest moment in modern history, and somewhere in a quiet farmhouse in Brittany, a father was trying to protect his daughter. He didn't make it. Neither did she, not in the way that counts. To understand what happened to Catherine Tournellec, you first have to understand the world she lived in. It is the summer of 1944, Brittany, France. The smell of war is everywhere, not the romantic smell of old films, but the real smell. Cordite and mud, diesel and rot. The liberation of France has begun, and with it, nearly 2 million Allied soldiers, American, British, Canadian, and others, have poured onto French soil. They are celebrated, worshipped, treated as saviours, and most of them are, but not all of them. By August 1944, Paris had fallen back into French hands. General de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées to a city in tears. The photographs from that march, the pressed uniforms, the outstretched arms, the women lifting children above the crowd, became the defining images of hope in the 20th century. Behind those images, however, was a different story, one that neither the American military nor the French government was eager to tell. In the weeks and months following D-Day, as American forces moved through Normandy, Brittany, and the Loire Valley, reports began to surface. Not of heroism, not of liberation, of rape. The historical record is imprecise, deliberately so. Scholars including J. Robert Lilly, whose research forms the backbone of this accounting, and Mary Louise Roberts, whose 2013 book What Soldiers Do examined the subject in meticulous, uncomfortable detail, have documented that between 152 and 181 American soldiers were formally tried for rape in France alone during the war years. The real number, accounting for unreported crimes, is almost certainly much higher. One of those cases began at a farmhouse in Brittany that history never bothered to put in its textbooks. Her name was Catherine. She was 17 years old. Her father, Eugène Tournellec, was 47. He had survived the German occupation by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. Her mother had learned to cook without butter, without meat, without hope. They had waited 4 years for the Americans to come. On the night of August 20th, 1944, a U.S. Army soldier appeared at their farmhouse door. What happened next, the Tournellec family would carry for generations. Eugène tried to protect his daughter. The soldier shot him. Then he raped Catherine. She was 17 years old. When Eugène Tournellec died, he left behind a widow and 6 children. Catherine survived, but she was left with a wound that would never fully heal, and a secret that would shadow her family for the next 80 years. She did not go to the authorities, not because she was indifferent to justice, but because she understood, in the way that women in occupied and liberated territories both understand, that justice was not on offer. The Americans were the liberators. The French government was barely functional. The village needed the soldiers' goodwill to eat, to be protected, to survive the remainder of the war. A rape accusation against an American soldier was not justice. It was a problem. So Catherine said almost nothing. For the rest of her life, she said almost nothing. It would be convenient to frame what happened to Catherine as an isolated failure. One bad man, one terrible night. But the historical record does not support that framing. The United States Army had a formal justice system during World War II, and on paper, it was rigorous. The Articles of War prohibited rape. Courts-martial could, and sometimes did, impose severe sentences, including execution. The US military carried out 70 executions in the European theatre during the war years, for crimes ranging from murder to rape. But buried within those numbers is something the official histories rarely emphasize. Of the 29 soldiers executed specifically for rape in France, 25 were black. 25 out of 29. And those men represented a fraction of the accused. Of the 152 soldiers formally tried for rape in France, by some scholarly counts, as many as 181 to 139 were black. Even though black soldiers made up only about 10% of the fighting force, this was not justice. This was racial theatre. Black soldiers were prosecuted aggressively, visibly, while white soldiers who committed the same crimes were more often quietly discharged, transferred, or simply never charged. Scholars have documented the pattern in military court records. The punishment, when it came, fell hardest on men who had crossed two lines, the crime and the colour. It is worth noting, and this is not an excuse but a context, that historians, including Alice Kaplan, have observed that the US military was, by the standards of wartime armies, more willing than many of its counterparts to prosecute soldiers for sexual crimes at all. The disparity was not between action and inaction. It was between who was prosecuted and who was not. That distinction does not soften the racial injustice, but it matters for understanding the full shape of what happened. Meanwhile, French authorities were incentivized to cooperate with silence. France needed American reconstruction aid. France needed diplomatic standing. France needed to rebuild its national story. And that story required the Americans to be heroes, not monsters. So the files were closed. The reports were buried. The women who came forward were discouraged, dismissed, or simply not believed. And women like Catherine, who carried their stories in private, disappeared entirely from the record. Years passed, then decades. Catherine grew older. She married a man named Jean Salaun. She had children, 3 daughters and a son. She did not tell them, in plain words, what had happened to her on that August night in 1944. And yet, as her children would later say, on some level, they always knew. Something in the house, something in her silences, something in the way she cried at night. I thought it was something we kids did to hurt her, her youngest daughter, Mary would say, many years later. The silence became so complete, so deeply embedded in the architecture of daily life, that it must have felt, on many mornings, like the event had happened to someone else entirely. Except it hadn't. Trauma does not observe the same clock as memory. It does not fade with time in the way ordinary grief does. It calcifies. It changes shape. It moves through the body in ways that cannot be spoken and therefore cannot be resolved. In 2013, Mary Louise Roberts published her study of American soldiers and sexual violence in liberated France. Roberts was among the first historians to consult both American and French archives on this subject, building on earlier foundational work by scholars like J. Robert Lilly and Alice Kaplan. Her book reached a wider audience than most. It named the pattern. It documented the collusion. It forced, briefly, uncomfortably, a reckoning in both France and the United States. That same year, 2013, Catherine Tournellec was on her deathbed. And for the first time in her life, she told her children what had happened. One by one. "You believe me, don't you?" Her daughter Marie remembers her asking. What compels a woman, in her final days, to finally break a silence she has carried for nearly 7 decades? There is no single answer. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the historical record, if she did not correct it, would simply erase her. Perhaps it was the weight of the decades themselves. The accumulated cost of silence finally exceeding the cost of speaking. Perhaps it was simply the approach of the end and the particular clarity that comes with it. When the Tournellec children began to speak, to each other, to journalists, eventually to documentary filmmakers, they did not perform grief. They stated what had happened to their mother and grandfather in plain language. They described the farm, the night, the sound of a shot, the silence that followed for 80 years. Their testimony was recorded. It appeared in a French documentary. It was reported on by NPR and other outlets in 2024 on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the liberation. The American government made no response. The French government made no response. There was no apology, no formal acknowledgement, no ceremony beyond the one the family organised themselves, gathering at Eugène Tournellec's grave in the village of Plabennec, with the local mayor and 2 French veterans bearing flags. The first time in 80 years that anyone had publicly honoured him. Our grandfather may not have died for France under enemy bullets, Jean-Pierre Salon said, reading from a paper and choking back tears. His field of honour was his home, where he tried to protect his children. The soldier who attacked Catherine and killed Eugène, Private William Mack, a 34-year-old black soldier from South Carolina, was hanged by the US Army in February 1945, not for the rape, but for the murder. His execution was carried out to demonstrate, as the family would later put it, that the army was taking responsibility. Nobody here asked for him to be executed, said Jeanine Plassard, one of Catherine's daughters. The US Army did it to show it was taking responsibility, but it was the liberation and everyone was happy and finally free. This was just our family's pain. The family says they do not blame the Americans, they blame the silence. Here is the uncomfortable architecture of what happened, not just to Catherine Tournellec, but across liberated France. Both governments had rational institutional reasons to suppress these stories. For the United States, the liberation narrative was, and remains, foundational to American identity in the 20th century. The greatest generation, the arsenal of democracy. The soldiers who died on the beaches of Normandy are sacred figures in the American imagination. To complicate that image, to insert into it the reality that some of those same soldiers were also rapists who escaped justice, is to destabilize something the country built its post-war self-understanding upon. For France, the calculus was different but equally powerful. The French national memory of the war was already burdened by collaboration, by Vichy, by the uncomfortable reality that not every Frenchman had been a resistant. The liberation by Allied forces provided a clean, heroic ending to a morally tangled story. To revisit that ending, to insist on its costs, was to reopen wounds that the French Republic had decided, at the highest levels, to let close. The women paid for that decision. They paid in silence. They paid in isolation. They paid in the particular loneliness of knowing that the truth of what happened to them was less important to the institutions that governed their lives than the story those institutions needed to tell. As Jean-Pierre Salin put it, picking up a book about his village during the Second World War, a book that mentioned the horses that were killed, but not a word about his grandfather. There's not a word in here about our grandfather. That book is The Silence, made physical. The historical work continues. Scholars at universities on both sides of the Atlantic have spent years in military archives, regional French records, and personal testimonies. Each new study adds specificity to what was once described only in the vaguest terms, if described at all. One such witness was a French writer named Louis Guillou, who spoke English and served as an interpreter for US military courts-martial in Brittany in 1944, attending the proceedings and recording what he saw. He eventually published his account in 1976, to almost no notice. It would take another 30 years before American historians began seriously examining what he had witnessed. The numbers that emerge from this scholarship are not precise. They cannot be. The suppression was too complete, the discouragement too effective. But the shape of the problem is now undeniable. Hundreds of French women were raped by American soldiers in 1944 and 1945. A significant portion of perpetrators were never prosecuted. Of those who were prosecuted, the outcomes were shaped as much by race and rank as by guilt. And the women themselves were left, overwhelmingly, without recourse, without recognition, and without the language to speak what had been done to them into a world that did not want to hear it. Catherine Tournellec was one of them. She was not the exception. She was the pattern. Catherine Tournellec died in 2013, the same year the scholarship about what had happened in 1944 finally reached a wider public. She is buried in Tournellec, Brittany, the same region where, in the summer of 1944, the world celebrated the arrival of freedom. She received no apology from either government. Neither government has acknowledged her by name. Her father, Eugène Tournellec, lies in the same village. For 80 years, now the book about his town mentioned the horses that were killed, but not the man who died on his own doorstep trying to protect his child. The word liberation comes from the Latin liberare, to set free. Catherine Tournellec waited a lifetime for someone to ask her what she had been freed from. When someone finally did, her own children, in her final days, she told them the truth. It didn't change the past, but it meant that the silence, at least, the silence that both governments had so carefully constructed, so diligently maintained, was no longer complete. And perhaps that is the only justice that history, when it fails its victims in life, can offer them afterward. The record.